Good morning, everybody. How are we doing today? It's a Monday morning. Spent most of the weekend working on the trading cards and reading comments, and I sense there's some excitement about it, which is awesome. I still am debating my best path forward, and there's several things that from the comments I think people weren't thinking about. I don't know if I can just use photographs of these people in a commercial sense. I think as an educational tool, I'll be fine giving away as promo. If you sign up for Patreon, you get access to this set of cards. It's another thing, trying to sell something. You have cost up front, which I'm in no place to undertake right now in any way. But again, you're looking at when you start making money on something directly like that, there's suddenly more legal issues that can come into play. And maybe someone out there can give me some counsel on that. Me and the wife have been doing some research, but a lot of it's kind of tough to decipher and where the lines are. My wife did think there's probably pages I could go to that could get photos I can use legally, but I think a lot of these great jazz artists aren't going to be on those pages. Some of them are tough to find even in Google imaging alone. The rarer we go. The next question with the cards is, how do I get them to you guys? And I still think the best way to go for cost reasons and for allowing variables is just to make them available as downloads through Patreon. And the question is how many, how often. And we're thinking 20 to 24 a week, me and the wife were talking. And then you go to your Patreon, you download them, keep them on your computer if you want in a folder, or you can print them off. And we're kind of thinking an 8x11 sheet having 4 per page, which would be bigger than the average card. But again, if I leave it up to you guys, you can print them how you want, from wallet size to full page photos if you want. I'm also still unsure what we're going to do with the backs. Part of me wants to leave that open for you to print what you want on the backs, whether it's a checklist of albums you're looking for or what you have. I do think a little bio might be needed on some level back there, maybe some important records. I'm punting a few things around. I've made 132 front cards so far, and we're so not that far into the jazz kingdom yet. And I think in that 132 artists, I've done maybe 14 trumpet players. I gotta cover at least 40. Saxophone, I think I've done maybe 35 in that 132. There's probably at least 100 saxophonists we need to talk about. And so this set, piano, trumpet, sax, the 3 biggest ones, bass and drums, will probably have 20 to 30 guys. Organ, maybe 15, 20 guys. Vibes, same. Some of the instruments will have less, but some of the main instruments just have so many guys that are noteworthy. And so I think this first set's going to run 400 cards. And at this point, I'm thinking about making it just promotional, available on Patreon if you subscribe to Patreon. Again, I still want feedback. I'm curious to measure demand, because people have mentioned these NFTs, non-furbishable tokens, which is another language I'm not that familiar with, or not at all familiar with. And sometimes that makes people like my age shy away from something. I don't want to delve into something that I'm not familiar with. Even as a casual viewer of the channel, something that's a different language might not be that interesting to people. I'm sure more younger people are more familiar with that. So my thought on that is, I'm going to hit this first set out there, this promotional set. That I'll establish a groundwork of the canon, who's the members of that kingdom. 400 deep is the number I'm targeting right now. And I'm at 132, and I think at 400 I'll have a fairly good grasp of the jazz age, which we're defining as 1925 to 1970. We'll probably get a few guys who show up late in the 60s, and we'll add those guys in there. But we're not going to delve into the 70s and 80s in this series necessarily. seeing how things go. But possibility is, once we have this established and we see what the demand is and how many people loved them versus kind of fell off and didn't have interest after a couple of weeks, that's what I need to figure out. And if I find that a lot of people collected them and loved them and wanted the whole set, then we start doing specialized sets, kind of miniature sets of 25, maybe a 60, and maybe make those NFTs, and maybe go out to find licensed photographs that we can use so we can actually generate more revenue with them. Again, this is all kind of speculative at this point, but what if we had a series of the Great Basie Kingdom of 50 guys, 50 cards, and then did a series on the Legends of Hardbop and had 40 cards in that series, and then we launch another series, the Great Female Jazz Singers. Get all the real in between the crack gals that are great little singers people don't know about, the Teddy Kings, the Marlene Van Planks, all those kind of gals. So you have a set of 40 jazz singers. Do one for the guy singers. I see all these different potential. Do a set on the avant-garde guys, the Cecil Taylors, the spooky guys that I'm not so crazy about in my older age. But there's a lot of potential ways you can go with this trading card idea. And trading cards are a hot commodity right now, which is interesting that it's back. And how does jazz fit and all that? I'm not sure. And that's something I'm trying to measure. So what I don't want to do is start selling cards that I have no right to sell. And so we need to do some more research on that. And if you have any information, please fill me in. Let me know what you know. We're doing research on our end as well. My wife especially, she's the best at kind of researching this kind of stuff. And we're curious on the NFTs, and we think we're going to do something down the road with that, especially if the demand is there. But how many cards do you guys want a week? And if you're just downloading and putting them in a folder, I guess you don't really care how many you're doing. You put them in a folder and you're done with them, and you can put them on, a loop to watch them or just open them up and look at them. But if you're actually going to print them out, how many is a reasonable number? If you do too few, it spreads it out too long and people lose interest. And I don't want to do that. If you do too many at once, it's too overwhelming and you start printing them and the cost maybe gets a little high. My thinking is this, and this is I'm just preliminary here. If we do 400 cards at 4 per sheet, which gives you a card slightly bigger than the average trading card, but you can shrink those down to trading card size if you wanted and still do 4 per sheet. That would be up to you. The variable there for the printer. I thought as you buy one stack of 100 card stock printable glossy paper, one binder of one, what's the word for paper? I can't think of it. One book of 100 sheets. With 4 per page, you end up getting 400 cards out of that. So each person can print them themselves. It's kind of how I'm seeing it for those who want to print them and what size they want to print them as. So I kind of think that's how we're going to do this first series. And this first series is meant to be educational. It's meant to be fun. It's meant to be so you can collect them and look at them in different ways. If you want, you can sort them all by region. And it's crazy seeing doing this. 132 cards I've done. How limited black people were allowed to live in America. You know what I mean? You show me 132 white guys, and they're coming from all over the place. Black folks come from a few places in this era. Still today, it's fairly, segregated. But in this day, you came from Detroit, Philadelphia, New York, Harlem, it's small. It's Pittsburgh, Chicago. It's a small, and then you got some guys from the South who all worked their way north eventually, and then Los Angeles has its own little group. And even a lot of the great white jazz players in this area come from east and went west. But so you can sort them geographically and see all the great Detroit players, all the great New York, Philly players. Put them all in different piles. You can sort them by instrument and have your little stack of all your drummers, all your stack of all your bass players, all your stack of your vibraphonists, your singers. That's another great way you can sort them and see all the great alto players and baritone players and clarinetists of these eras. Put them all against each other in these cards. You could sort them chronologically because each card has on it, it's their era of when they were active players. And so you can see who shows up when, put them all chronologically, you can see who's the innovator, who's the leader, who's following the footsteps of who were contemporaries with each other. You can sort them alphabetically, which, that's always a way to go. You can sort them in a little number sequence I put on them, which is a random number just to assign them a number, like any trading card series has. You can sort them that way. I've set it up so that you're still getting legends here in the 200s and 300s. There's still going to be a lot of really big names. That first tier of guys only goes so deep for most people, but this is supposed to give people insight into other people of the jazz canon, including great players like this Johnny Costa, who's a Pittsburgh native, and Costa was a fantastic player. He just started to getting some renown, and he ends up moving to New York for a while and becomes a fairly big, hyped up personality that's about to break through. But he decides that this isn't really for him. And he goes back to Pittsburgh and plays locally in Pittsburgh for years. Absolutely a beautiful player, great dynamic, great rhythmic center. And he goes from things like this into these all of a sudden fast, furious Art Tatum-like lines. You're like, where did that come from? Just double timing it. Interesting guy, hard record to find is this old Savoy. But the idea of these trading cards is if you get most of the artists who made records on these eras, and even a few sidemen who are very important people who didn't get to make records as leaders. Some of the guys are noteworthy. Wendell Marshall, one of the great bass players, played on hundreds of sessions, was the go-to guy at Savoy throughout the late 50s. And then in the 60s is that he does so many records at Prestige, it's shocking he didn't get to make a record as a leader in there somewhere, especially at Prestige. But it wasn't the case, but he's still a very important player. You gotta know Wendell Marshall. And so I'm just putting all these names out there, trying to, mix up the different instruments in the sequence. And then as we get them, there's all this stuff to be gleaned and learned. A lot of it's stuff that you had to have this big collection for me to learn it. And these cards will be a shortcut for you to learn some of this stuff. So there's a fun element, there's an educational element. Hopefully there's some economic benefit for me by having a few more patrons sign up to get access to these cards. But so that's where I'm at with the cards. Again, there seems to be quite a bit of interest, which I'm excited about. So I'm going to leave that part right there as we go into the next part of this video. Number 5, number 1 actually, I want to talk about 5 things that still excite me about jazz. 5 things that I find thrilling. And even after all these years of being a jazz collector and a jazz fan, there's still some things that still get my excitement going. And it's not kind of the traditional things that most people are going to say about jazz. There's some different levels of insight that I want to share with you. Most of these things I've talked about on some level before, of course. But these are the 5 things that still excite me about jazz the most. Number 5, the tempos, the grooves, the sex appeal. I'm going to show you. That's a pattern. Right there. That guitar, it's just a groove. And that is an encapsulation of that black sound of sensual, soft. You don't have to be hard and heavy to groove. Ask Al Green. He does that soft gospel groove. But a groove that breathes and pulses and sets aside the ego of composition and my ego and my ability and makes more of a cohesive, interlocking set of sounds that repeats, like we talked about that last episode of Groove. To me, that's one of the most exciting things about jazz. And when it's really good, it's enticing, it's enthralling, it's alluring, it just draws me in, and I find myself just like loving it. Effortless joy. It's I think it's something people overlook. I think we've grown up on hip hop and pop music, and we forget that pop music and hip hop comes from the blues and jazz. They're borrowing these ideas that jazz incorporates and refines. Even James Brown heard Louis Jordan and Count Basie. The links are so direct, and Brown is the antecedent of all that pop music, R&B music, hip-hop music today, that looping pattern, as I've said before. So I'm going to show you number 4 next. Number 4, and this is probably the most obvious of the bunch, is the improvised solos. And they're exciting in and of themselves. When you're a new jazz fan, just the virtuosity of it, the incredible personality that kind of is exhibited through these solos. But when you delve into that next level of understanding and comprehension, and you recognize that these solos aren't just improvised technique and ability, they're improvised emotion. That's such a magical thing, that what you're capturing. You're capturing someone's mindset, emotional place of being in that time and moment, like no other music or even art form can really do. The immediacy, the ability for it to graft and change itself from day to day to suit and coat my needs at that time. A painting is static. It can't adapt to your next changes of mood unless you change the painting itself. But art doesn't have that same interchangeability. Most music is written very static and is performed the same way. And I've spoken on this many times. Jazz is forever an immediate expression of how I feel right now. And until you capture that, you're not really hearing jazz. You're certainly not feeling it. You might be hearing it, you might be listening to it, but if you want to feel it, try to grasp what a certain person is trying to get across. And that's where understanding is important, because the bigger your empathy is, the more your understanding is of Black history and the history of this country, the more you'll have the ability to understand what they're trying to say to you. It's like any famous painting or 1812th overture. If you don't have the context of the times it was written in and the opponents that these people faced, the injustices, the wars, the conflicts, the starvations, whatever it is, most art is driven by something that it needs to be said and spoken. So that having that understanding is very important to be able to hear that improvised virtuosity, what it's saying to us. And it's such a unique thing about jazz, and I just love it. It still excites me, because I can still be sitting there doing my own thing, all of a sudden be like, number 3 of the things that excite me a lot about jazz. And again, I think it's something that's overlooked too often. And it's something that the free avant-garde cats are missing. Is the conversation. And as much as the excitement can be from one person emoting and improvising on that emotion, that level of excitement ratchets up when you have 2 or 3 or 4 people complimentary having a conversation with each other, with empathy and sympathy and interaction. And that's a greater degree of involvement for the participant and for the listener. It's an added enjoyment hearing Joe Wilder echoing and ghosting over the top of Marlene Van Planck, which is another great, rare Savoy record. This is a library item, honestly, but it's such a fantastic record. And again, Wilder for me is really the star of the show. He's just so gorgeous on this. The rhythm section's unassailable with the great Hank Jones, Wendell Marshall, and Kendall Clark, the aforementioned Wendell Marshall. There's not a lot of records in the Savoy first 100 records in the 12,000 series that those 3 aren't the rhythm section. There's a lot. Kenny Clark's on so many of those Savoys, and Hank and Wendell are on almost as many. You know, and they show up sometimes without each other as well. Kluk the most, Kenny Clark, shows up on the most sessions, but Marshall's on the present, and then he goes to Prestige again. So these guys are also important, and that's part of why this jazz card thing is supposed to be a knowledge broadener for people. So if they have this set of cards, even if it's just virtually on your desktop, but if you print it out, you will learn stuff. The geography, the chronology, the in between the cracks players, the important rhythm section guys that were a lot session work and not a lot as leaders. There's so many guys in jazz that are of value, and it'll all enhance your knowledge so that when you're record shopping, things will pique your interest. Like, oh, I remember him talking about John Wright. I have John Wright's card. Sonny Chris, ooh, that's exciting. He's supposed to be a great leader. And so again, putting what I put on the back is got to be, I don't want it to be too labor intensive for obvious reasons. It's one thing doing the fronts, which take me about 10-15 minutes per card, and not work as I'm turning 20-30 out a day right now. But adding all that minutia on the back, how deep do I want to go with that? I think I want to put some notes that give you a quick synopsis of what's important about this person. And then, again, do I leave some open space for you to put stuff in? Or do I just fill in a discography and most important titles? When you get down to a card size, it's going to limit how much we can put on the backs of these. So, again, I'm kind of still bouncing a lot of that stuff around. But the conversation is such an important part of jazz. And when you have 5 guys all talking over top of each other in cacophony, there's no conversation happening. You can't have 5 people all talking at the same time and have anybody make sense of any of it. And so much about rock and roll differs, how it differs from R&B, rhythm and blues, is exactly that. And what makes a band like the Stones so impressive, that's what they borrow from rhythm and blues, is Richards writes a groove, a rhythm. The bass puts a little thing in, the drums lay down a pattern. Next thing you know, you have rhythm and blues. Versus, say, punk rock or Nirvana, where everyone's just like, go! And everyone's like playing at the same time. Metallica, bass and guitars and drums are all, ah! There's not a lot of dialogue between the musicians. There's not a personality being exposed. It's just the meat of the song that's very going to be static and stoic forever. And every time we play Masters of Puppets, it's just going to be that. And that's so different with jazz and with black music in general. Conversation. I had a good day today. Me too, buddy. Me too. What are you saying about that? Okay, I feel you. It's got to have some of that. That's exciting. And I think it's very subliminal, and it's on the periphery of most people's grasp. Some people get it, but I also feel there's a lot of people who don't get it at all. When they tell me they love the cacophony of the Love Supreme live in Seattle, there's no conversation there. Elvin Jones is just screaming. McCoy's just trying to be heard. The bass players are fighting each other. You can't hear them. And then the horn players are just out there battling, playing their percussion. It's a lot of mess. There's not a lot of dialogue to be deciphered. And again, for me, art is always about trying to, on some level, decipher, A, what it makes me feel, and how am I connecting to it and why. And then what is the landscape that this art was made in, so I can understand where those people are coming from and what they are probably really saying. That's a tangible point of art. It's the meaning behind it. The Bible has its power because of the story that actually goes behind it. You know what I mean? It's tangible. If we just had the Bible and didn't have any of the context, it wouldn't have any meaning. It's coming out of slavery and captivity and then saying, I shall not be afraid of walking through the valley of death. That's got some power. Context is everything. And so the conversational aspect of jazz, it's magical. And I think it's so overlooked so often. Sticking with Savoy here, an album that's kind of since now been considered a Hank Mobley record, but certainly wasn't at its inception. It was just a blowing session at Savoy Records. Pretty incredible lineup on this. Pretty tough record to come by, these old Savoy records with these name players on them. Bird, Mobley, Silver, Watkins, Laporta, Ronnie Ball, Wendell Marshall, Kenny Clark. So it's a pretty outstanding group of players with that famous Savoy background. This is number 2 on my list of things that excite me about jazz. And this is probably the one thing that I think most people least get. And I think a lot of deep jazz heads out there get all the stuff I'm saying about groove and the stuff I'm saying about conversation, you know. I think it's not too out there. This one, number 2 on my list, I feel is very lost, and I've not heard anybody else really say it. But to me, it's eternally exciting. And I've said a couple times before how these black men and women coming out of the oppression of slavery and Jim Crow took instruments that weren't theirs, that they had no context with, no history with, and completely reinvent every one of them. I think it's so lost on us. But trumpets, saxophones, none of these instruments, the vibes, the bass, none of these instruments ever sounded like they sounded before these freed African slaves took their captors' instruments, essentially. You can make a Star Trek episode of some on a far distant planet about an enslaved people that came from another planet and were brought here to work in the sugarcane fields or the what have yous. And they ended up finding their captors' instruments and bringing new, exciting, and unbelievable sounds out of those instruments. It's a pretty cool thing if you think about it. And it was being from segregation, where the blues and the cotton fields was really the only instruments they had. A washboard and maybe a 3/4 string guitar. Like, you use what was available to you. And when you were a rural Mississippian, instruments weren't just available to you readily. You know, a Hammond organ wasn't part of your landscape. It's a lucky thing that the pipe organ wasn't something that the brothers could get a hold of, because then they put that funk in the pipe organ. See what I'm saying? But when they got their hands on the trombone, they put the funk in it. When they got their hands on the piano, when they got their hands on the clarinet, a flute, they can make a flute funky because of that whole shared experience of expression, of emotion, of joy through sexuality as a source of freedom, as a luxury. It's all this interwoven fabric of an oppressed people squeezing the fabric of love and joy and happiness out of a very unpleasant life. In spite of this box of lemons I'm living in, this is a pretty good lemonade. Not bad. It's not to make you pop the monocle out of your eye for a second and go, I want some lemon juice in my eye. Can you squeeze me a little bit of that fresh? That good? I want some of that right here now. It's again, it's something you don't really think about very often. But as integration starts to happen for real, and the urban migration comes north with the Great Migration of black into the north, black schools start getting more white band instruments available to black kids. And even guys like Armstrong and Storyville, they start getting these instruments in their boys' homes, and they transform every instrument that they come across. Much like they've done with sport. Every sport they've come across, they transformed it. Every instrument they've come across, they've done the same thing. And we don't really kind of hear it because most of our understanding of music doesn't go back to even the dawn of jazz, let alone pre-jazz. We don't really know ragtime. We don't really know the things that were pre, the minstrelsy and the music of white choir America and the refinement of the European tradition. We don't think about how elegant and sophisticated our Anglican, Lutheran, Presbyterian experience must be. It's very rigid and not casual. It's not inspired in the moment. It's very much a tradition. And they turn all that on its head in such a way that it's hard to really put into words or grasp it. But every once in a while you're like, oh man, that saxophone was a marching instrument that did a bloop, bloop, bloop. You know what I mean? All these instruments never did none of the things what Armstrong did with the trumpet. These instruments were written parts in, symphonic pieces, given choruses and chords to play as a trumpet section, adding color, adding a mood. But they weren't this vehicle for a man to take his personality out there and go, here you are, world, this is who the F I am. That's spectacular. And you see some of that even, in sports when these guys do something a little bit more flamboyant. the Latin baseball players are starting to do some of that stuff with the bat tosses and the jumping up and downs and some of the, putting a little bit of them into it. And the jazz kingdom is laced with people expressing their personality and their joy in an instrument that had never worn those clothes before. It's pretty cool. I think it's very much a lost thing. And then number one, and this is probably the most stated by me, but it still is super exciting, and it's kind of an encapsulation of all what I've said already. Number one is the social compact that is released through the information called jazz. It's a reflection of history, just like the Old Testament is a reflection of the children of Israel coming out of Egypt into Canaan. There's really not a difference. It's the same voice of those without a voice, chronicling a remembrance, stating their place in the world. And through their trials and tribulations, they've developed a moral compass that allows them to at least envision what a better world should look like. When you live in the corruption of Babylon in America, and you kind of trickle down enough in the riches that you live comfortably, you don't really see the plight of those who have less. You ignore those who are on the periphery of the empire and that don't have the luxuries of free clean water, heat, and electricity. We don't think about them enough because we're too comfortable to really be too concerned. It's when you live without what everybody else has, sometimes for generations, sometimes for centuries. It's that type of exposure to inequality and injustice that allows you to skip the dreamy euphoria of fake mansions and gilded palaces. That's not what we really want. I mean, sure, that stuff could be nice, but you start to quantify what really would matter and what you really want for your people. And it comes down to the most basic essence. Happiness for us would simply be knowing my children can live peacefully. Knowing that there's food on the table to feed my family. Knowing that I can trust that water will be there for me to consume and the fish will be there for me to harvest. Knowing that there's enough for me to live not on the edge of survival, but comfortably. That becomes paradise. And we lose track of paradise when we've lived too long in it. And we start to allow our expectations to exceed anything that's really to be expected. And I've often said the key to happiness in the Western world today is to know the difference between what you want and what you need. And living in oppression for centuries helps you define what we really need. All the stuff, we can want some of that, but we need this. This is what we need. The minimum. This is the essential. And there's a freedom in actually finding that, because it allows that pressure of expectation to fade away. I don't need those things. I'm not going to stress about not having those things. What I need is this. Food, shelter, love, support, family, health. Those things are what are essentials. And jazz, it like that Bible, like those people coming out of the Sinai desert into Canaan. Jazz was these people saying, you know what? In spite of all this drudgery, we're putting on my dancing shoes. I don't want to talk about that. No, not tonight. Tonight we're going to have a good time. Tonight we're going to be free. In spite of all this. And there's nothing more liberating than living with joy in spite of your captor, in spite of your oppressor. Because in spite of their power and wealth, they actually still don't have happiness. Because they've misconstrued what happiness is. And they've made it an unattainable thing that can't be taken or grasped. It's the people with nothing that can recognize what happiness is, and they actually find moments of it in spite of their circumstance. And jazz, every ballroom, every hootenanny, every town party, every time a jazz band got together and blew down those walls. And this is true for white folks as well as black folks, but especially the black experience in America. It was liberating, joyful, powerful expression of love and thankfulness for still being here. And as powerful as it is, it's enticing and alluring to the whites who don't quite have that shared experience, but they can feel the magnetic power of it. It's like, wow, there's something about that that's just, can I get a little bit of that too? I can't really do what you're dancing on, but Lindy hopping. Like, you Lindy hopped when you found the keys of the kingdom. Tell me that's not an expression of joy. Watch these people throw each other between each other's legs and spinning and all. Mind-blowing. Mind-blowing watching some of that footage of those guys doing and gals doing that stuff. Tell me it's not an expression of joy. And the Lindy hopping thing goes through the Great Depression. Things are tough for black and white right now, but let's go dancing. Let's get some of that sexuality out in the open. And those of you who got the good moves will probably get some good grooves later on. Moves and grooves kind of do go together. If you can't shuffle it on the dance floor, you probably ain't no good on the floor bed neither. So we don't know. These are the 5 things that excite me about jazz still to this day. And that one about the instruments being taken from their captors and said, y'all know how to play this shit. Let me show y'all. That's just so cool. It's such a joyous way to look at it even. That in spite of all the horrible, negative, sad things that have happened, and you can go, I can make episode after episode about tragedies in the black community and the injustices. But sometimes it's also great to reveal and revel in the powerful victories. And there's no greater victory for me than the documentation of jazz through inspiration by my emotional experience through a horn that I took from you guys. You see what I'm saying? That's just so magical. Let me borrow your instrument and kind of reflect on how you can't really hold me down. You might think you can, but what do you think of this? You never thought trombone could do all that, did you? And everyone will come along. The great innovators, J.J. Johnson, Louis Armstrong, Charlie Parker, Jimmy Smith. They all do things on those instruments that no one thought that instrument could do. That's part of the magic. It's so incredibly ironic, and I don't know if that's the right word even, but it's satisfying is what it is. It's satisfying. So I hope you all enjoyed that today. My phone died, so I had to come upstairs to my office. Let me get some feedback on those cards. Still appreciate all of y'all who've been helping through Patreon. Go to the merchandise store, grab something.